If your desire is to become spiritually stronger, emotionally healthier, and relationally smarter, you're at the right place. Speaker and writer Stephanie Smith inspires and equips you to achieve these 3 key aims. If you're a parent, you also learn how to raise empowered kids, ready for adulthood. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the Godly Impact Podcast. If you are new around here, welcome aboard. And for those of you that have been longtime listeners, or maybe just kind of medium-time listeners, welcome. I am delighted that you are here. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and then share this with friends, because the things that we talk about on this podcast really do make a difference in life. Everything that you are going to find here is designed to help you become spiritually strong, emotionally healthy, and relationally smart. Because here's the thing, we never get to the point in life where we have all of those things nailed down. Okay, I got it. I'm good. I've arrived. Okay. If you ever happen to think that that is, where you are, just ask some of the people around you, because I'm sure that they would be more than happy to tell you, actually, there's probably a few more things that you need to work on. So it's much better if we just acknowledge that for ourselves. Well, we are in a series called It's All in Your Head, because so much of our lives are determined by this practice that we've been talking about, and that is the stories that we tell ourselves, because we tell ourselves stories dozens, hundreds of times every single day. And why does this matter? Because our stories become our beliefs become our actions become our nature, and our nature becomes our impact. So far in this series that we've looked at, just kind of highlight a couple of these things. First of all, it's to become intentional, to become aware of all the stories you tell yourself. You might keep a journal. You might put a check mark on an index card each time you catch yourself just telling yourself a story. You might just be surprised by the sheer number of stories that you are telling yourself every day. Some of those might be 7-second stories, and some of those could take an hour and a half. You see, this skill is better known as what's called metacognition, and that's just a fancy way of saying, I think about what I think about. And that is one of the marks of a person of maturity. You see, your level of self-awareness is either going to be limited or expanded by how much attention that you give to the stories that you tell yourself. Self-awareness has nothing to do with selfishness. I mean, as a rule, now there are exceptions, I'll grant you that, but as a rule, the more self-aware a person is, the less likely they are to be self-absorbed. And like I said, of course, there are exceptions. But for anyone who's devoted to a life of maturity and godly impact, this will hold true. Because the more self-aware we are, then the more that we see, we've got some things that need to be changed in us. And we can either become afraid of that, we can become discouraged by that, or we can look at that and say, thank you, God, that you have provided a way for us to change, so that we're not just hopeless and stuck with, whoever we are at the moment. The other thing that we've looked at is to pay attention to how defensive or emotionally attached am I to my stories. How do I respond if somebody challenges them? Because the more that we're threatened by someone suggesting a different perspective might actually more accurately represent the truth, the more likely that we have some degree of ownership or confirmation bias at work. And remember, we talked about ownership and confirmation bias. It's that very same thing that keeps us hanging on to clothes in our closet that we needed to get rid of a long time ago, but hey, they're ours, we own them, and so we feel a responsibility to them like we wouldn't if we didn't already own them. And once we've told ourselves certain stories, we're going to look for evidence to prove our stories, even though sometimes we totally distort the evidence, right? We don't always get that right at all. And we look for things to support our stories. So we don't have to decide to do that. We are hardwired to do that. We will do that by default. Instead, what we need to do is we need to invest the hard work into challenging our stories and being willing to have them challenged. Now, last week, we began looking at Okay, what exactly are these macro stories that we tell ourselves about people and people groups that are far away and impersonal? Impersonal. Again, this doesn't mean that we don't care about these people or these groups or that they don't have any impact on us. Not at all. These are the stories that we tell ourselves that might be about celebrities, political parties, races, ethnic groups, leaders in big companies, workers on the plant floor in factories. You see, this is where stereotypes tend to lurk. And stereotypes are just a shortcut to the work of truly educating ourselves about a person or a group. So we want to be paying attention to those macro stories. And today what we're going to start focusing on are the macro stories that we tell ourselves about people that are up close and personal. And these are the stories that we tell about our spouse, our children, our family members, our friends, colleagues, it might be people in your church, in your small group, Sunday school class, whatever. These stories are macro because they often make big conclusions and they have big impact. Now, let me be clear about something. The goal in this series is not to convince you to stop telling yourselves stories. Not only is that impossible, but it's dangerous. We need to be telling ourselves stories about others. If I'm walking to my car in a parking lot and someone seems to be following me, I need to start writing a story. The goal isn't to make all of our stories, rainbows, unicorns, and chocolate cupcakes with sprinkles on top. The goal is for our stories to be accurate, not necessarily positive. Now I don't automatically start writing a positive story if I'm being followed in the parking lot. I don't need to automatically start, creating a worst case story. But I do need to be wise that my story is open to the idea that this person who's following me or seems to be following me might not be up to any good. And I need to be thinking about, okay, do I need to continue walking towards my car? Do I need to stop and turn around and go back into the store? Do I need to start running? Do I need to get out my phone and be ready to call 911? Or do I need to do something physically to put myself, put some self-defense skills, to work? So I keep that story open for editing because it may just turn out that the person following me just happens to be parked right next to me. So yeah, they're following me, but they're not following me with ill intent. But if I just assume that because I want to live in this fantasy world where nothing bad could ever happen to me, then that's when people end up getting themselves and can end up being in dangerous situations. Now, let me clarify. If you've had a traumatic encounter with someone, that doesn't mean that you're at fault because you weren't writing the right story. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. So I need to pay attention to the story because if I just assume that, there's nothing possibly that could be nefarious here, then I might put myself at risk. But I also don't want to just assume the worst and go try to put them in some sort of chokehold or something. I mean, that's not going to necessarily turn out well. The goal is that our stories are accurate, not always that they are positive ones. Now, I know that can seem like, okay, but what are the chances, of that happening? But I use that as kind of a simple example because it makes a difference also in the stories that we are telling ourselves, not about some stranger who is or isn't following us in a parking lot, but about the people in our lives. There's a difference between trying to talk ourselves out of warning signs and being open to having our stories challenged. So for example, if you're married and your spouse just keeps acting weird, they're keeping odd hours, they're spending time on the phone or computer out of earshot or where they don't want you around, they're not acting like themselves, you need to start writing a story. Now that story needs to begin with, I wonder if, not I absolutely know, okay? But you need to start writing a story that examines, okay, I need to know what's going on here. Too often what happens is that we just we just dismiss what's irritating our gut. And that is never a good idea. If something is irritating your gut, whether it's a virus or an emotion, you need to pay attention to that. Interestingly, physiologically, there's actually a physical connection in your body between your gut and your brain. And so when we use this phrase, well, I just kind of have this feeling in my gut, actually, that is oftentimes the place we need to really pay attention to, because our gut can sense, and our physical guts can sense things, and they send these warning signals sometimes to our brain. But here's what we always have to keep in mind. We are influenced by so many factors. We don't always get it right. As a matter of fact, we might get it wrong more times than not. And so this is, again, where we have to be willing to have our stories challenged. And part of that is we have to do some of those challenges ourselves. And we're going to talk about that in a future episode. Okay. So you don't want to just talk yourself out of something that is like bothering you. And you're like, oh, well, there's probably nothing going on. Or, well, I'm sure that, they're just working long hours at the office. Or, well, there's a difference between getting the information you need so that your story actually makes sense, and trying to talk yourself out of things so that you end up with a story that you want to be true, but isn't necessarily true. But you also don't want to assume the worst. And you don't want to become so convinced that your story is right that you never put in the time or energy to have the necessary conversations, to take the steps to learn, what's going on. There's a big difference between reaching a conclusion and then hunting for evidence, and looking at all the evidence and then reaching a conclusion. Sometimes sorting through our stories to determine, okay, what's really accurate here, what's partly accurate and partly false, and what's entirely wrong, nothing is right about this story, requires the help of an objective third party. And that's not a failure on our part. It's just the fact that we are not perfect human beings. We're not God. We don't know everything. We have our own limitations. We have our own perspectives. We have our own blind spots. And so sometimes we need to invite other people in to be able to not just give us the confirmation of our story, but that will have the courage to challenge our stories, not to dismiss them. There is a very big difference between having somebody just outright dismiss your concerns, your story, and having someone investigate, to be a co-investigator of your story with you. One of the practical things to keep in mind here is when you have a story about someone, a spouse, a family member, your kids, someone close to you, friends sometimes can be objective third parties, and sometimes they're not. Because friends can have their own confirmation bias going on. If they're your friend, they may really just side with you because they want you to feel good. They want you to feel supported. They want you to feel valued and appreciated. People aren't always the best, at least in our culture here in the United States. Don't know about the rest of the world, but here in the United States, I've made the observation that people are not always great about challenging somebody else's story and learning how to ask the questions, or knowing how to ask the kind of questions that somebody needs to be asking themselves. We have this tendency, I can't really say, I don't know if men do this as much, but I know women have more of a tendency to show up and to try to thinking that they're being supportive through agreement and affirmation, when in fact, sometimes the best support that women can give one another is to challenge one another, is to ask them hard questions. Again, challenging is not the same thing as being dismissive of your story. But it is saying, are you just making claims here, no matter how emotionally passionate you are about it? No matter that you have these pieces that you've put together and it looks like this is it, that's all it could possibly be. But being able to say, okay, but let's look at all the things here, because sometimes, you know what, it just takes a couple of other pieces of information that changes everything. And we don't want people, especially making significant life-altering decisions, because they've assembled 5 puzzle pieces and they put it together and it all looks great. It all looks done. It's like it's an open and shut case. There couldn't be any other explanation. But actually there is, because sometimes it's what gets left out that changes everything. You want friends who won't always let you believe whatever you think. Because one of the things that we all need to practice is this fact that we can't always believe what we think. Okay, just because we have a thought, just because we have a story that we're very emotionally attached to, that doesn't make it accurate. Because sometimes what we think is wrong. And, you know, we've talked about this in the last couple of episodes. One of the, I think the most significant and tragic and sobering examples of this in the Bible is King Saul. And God didn't just give us that story because he was trying to write an interesting history book. He gave us those stories so that we could look at those and apply those lessons to our own lives. And what began as a micro story for Saul eventually became a macro story. And the cost of that incorrect story, that David was a threat to him, consumed years of Saul's life. And not only that, but the nation's resources were consumed in these ongoing manhunts for David. And it kept Saul from being able to really accomplish everything that he could have accomplished because he got so distracted with this false story. By the way, as we're going through this episode, I do want to mention this is one of the talks that I give for women's groups, is this talk, it's all in your head. I do speaking for women's events and also for parents, for moms and dads, and also just some events, that are just for moms. You can find out all about that on the website, stephaniepresents.com. There's contact form, emails on there. So if you are part of a Christian school, a church, a homeschool organization, any faith-friendly organization, because I do speak from a position of the Christian faith, then reach out, and we can chat. You can look at some of the messages that I have on the website. I also do consider custom messages, so you can you're always welcome to contact me about those. So as we go back to this topic here on our macro stories, one of the things to keep in mind is that the intensity of our emotion is not an accurate measurement of how accurate our stories are or aren't. We can become so emotionally invested in and defensive over our macro, up close and personal stories, even more so than we are, those far away and impersonal ones. And it's not just true for the negative stories, but it's also true for the positive stories that we tell ourselves. And this can be especially true when it comes to stories that we tell about our kids. Have you ever known a parent whose kid, everybody within a 15-mile radius considered this kid to be a terror, but the parent just thinks this kid is an angel? If you just tried telling this parent, little mister there, can't seem to walk alongside another kid for more than 8 seconds without clobbering them. And the parent would act like, you just accused little mister of being a sociopath, right? Now, I'm as much of a mama bear when it comes to my kids and grandkids as anybody else is. But I have found that it is always far better to align with reality than try to avoid it. And so I know that this means that every story about my offspring isn't going to be a favorable one. And we would spend far less time grieving over kids as adults if we spent more time challenging the positive stories that we're telling ourselves about them when they're young. Now, again, this has to be kept in context. Of course, there are parents whose stories are never positive about their kids. their kids can never clean their room well enough. They're never good enough. They're not popular enough. They're not athletic enough. They're not smart enough. Okay, I get that. I understand there are kids who are desperate to have some positive story said about them. I understand that is a real problem. But our current parenting trends here in the United States are veering far more heavily to this fad of parents being unwilling to examine the stories that they are telling about their kids. And they're telling themselves, well, little mister, little miss, couldn't possibly be, fill in the blank, whatever it is. And it's like, oh, they're just all so loving and so good and so kind and so generous and so this and they just need us to just give them so much affirmation, and that's all that they need, and then they're going to grow up and be these wonderful, kind, loving people. And that does not align with reality. And so we want to make certain that we are telling ourselves accurate stories, and that's always going to be a combination of things that are positive and things that are negatives. These stories that we tell ourselves about people in our lives who are up close and personal, they're going to have a profound impact on the quality of our relationships, the amount and types of opportunities that we have, and the happiness that we experience. So this week, I want you to continue looking at those micro stories you're telling yourself, because again, if you tell yourself a bunch of micro stories every day about the rude driver who cut you off and the bad clerk in the store and the colleague who's always trying to take credit for your work, blah, blah, you are not going to go home and be able to tell yourself these warm, positive, upbeat stories about the people in your life, these up close and personal macro stories. It just doesn't work like that. So pay attention to both the micro and the macro stories that you are telling yourself, and make a note to start assessing, why am I telling myself these stories? And also pay attention, are there stories that maybe your gut's trying to write that you're trying to talk yourself out of? Because those stories matter too. Our stories become our beliefs become our actions, and our actions become our nature, and our nature becomes our impact. You do have an immeasurable, eternal, and irreplaceable impact. Let's make it a godly one. I'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening. Visit the website stephaniepresents.com to join the mission of building spiritually strong, emotionally healthy, and relationally smart women and families. You can also book Stephanie to speak at your event and check out additional resources. Together, we can invite and equip generations to engage fully in God's grand story.